If you're checking in on your team to see how they're going to come up against obstacles, listen to the way that they talk about them. Do they talk about them in the realm of defeat and like it's always going to be this way? Do they take the past and project it into the future? Or do they talk about them like, we don't yet know? We're not quite sure what's available to us. And we won't know until we go out on the battlefield, until we get out there on the field and start playing with it a little bit. And so that's the moment of transformation. And that's one of the takeaways that people can take away from this conversation is how well are you listening to your people as they relate to the constraints that are there? And can you identify when they see them as possibilities or they see them as a default future?
To Strategic Edge, our subtitle, Applying Transformative Leadership. We are glad you could join us today. We are a podcast for leaders and by leaders. We're going to interview the best and the brightest of leaders to be able to provide you information. We're here to inform, to instruct, and to inspire you on your leadership journey. My name is Ted Davis. My company is Grace Strategic Services, Inc. We're proud to be the sponsor of this podcast. And we encourage you to take the information that we're going to share, make it your own, absorb it, then reflect on it. What does it mean to you? And finally commit to an action plan. So with that, let's get started with today's episode. Welcome. I am so glad to welcome to today's podcast, Chad Brown. Chad is a fascinating gentleman. He works with family-focused founders to build their teams so they experience peace of mind. So he consolidates their freedom by helping them mastermind their mindset, build winning teams. I'll let him finish the rest of it. So, Chad, tell us a little bit about your background, how you got into this field, and what is it you're doing?
Thank you so much for having me, Ted. I appreciate the time and the opportunity to sit down with you to continue our conversations that we started a couple of days ago. I really enjoyed that. So thanks for the opportunity. Yeah, like you said, I coach mostly company founders, entrepreneurs. These would be startup level companies. And I usually coach them in a point of transition, meaning they have a decision. Do I grow this thing? And will it demand more of my time and attention and focus? Or do I keep it where it is in its happy little spot? And typically the ones that I work with, not typically, always the founders that I want to work with, want to scale their companies, but they also want to make sure that they maintain the lifestyle they want with their families. So, a lot of the work that I do, a lot of the programs that I develop and the techniques I develop in that aim. The reason I did that is because I started a film production company. A media production company is probably a better way of doing it. We did more than film. I started that in 2009. By 2012, it had completely taken over my life. And I had sacrificed my family, my health, and any potential hobby that I could ever have or focus outside of work. I sacrificed it all for the sake of building and scaling a business. And I got caught up in it. And I failed in every single way as a leader, both of my family and of my business. And each one of those failures represent a very significant lesson that I got to learn. I ended up turning it around with the help of a coach, which is how I got introduced to this kind of work. And turning it around meant growing it significantly without changing my lifestyle with my family, and then ultimately selling it a couple of years ago. So that's how I got here. I've been doing this work for about 7 years, and I wouldn't rather do anything else with my life.
Good. Well, were you able to save your family?
Yes, I was. Luckily, my wife and my kids are very forgiving, and they were willing to go on the journey with me.
Excellent. How many kids?
3 kids.
Wow. Teenagers now? Or?
Yeah, I've got one going off to college in 2 weeks. She's going to move up to the University of Utah, and I got a 15-year-old, so she started driving just a couple of weeks ago, and then I've got an 11-year-old who lives for breakdance and soccer.
Congratulations. Does your wife work outside the home, or?
She does. She's a yoga instructor. That's kind of her primary thing. And then she also, it's a weird little niche, but her dad owns a construction review company. They review construction projects and give a percentage to the bank so that the bank knows how much money to release for the project. So she does that as something that she can just kind of do as it fits in.
Excellent. So you coach her as well?
Yeah, of course. No, that's rule number one. As a coach, never coach your family.
I would agree with that. I've been married for 48 years. Wonderful marriage. As I tell people, if I was 18, had to do it over again, I'd still go to West Point, still make the Army my first career, and I'd marry the same woman. So
Yeah.
but I would agree. Do not coach your spouse. Do not do that. Anyway,
Yeah.
so let's get into you're working with an entrepreneur. They've got so much they want to do. They got this brain idea. They're growing a company or sale or whatever. So tell us about the process that you take them through.
Yeah. So each one of my clients, they have one thing in common, and that is that they want to grow something. They want to go somewhere. They have an aim that they're headed towards. That's the first thing they have in common. The second thing that they have in common is that they all have constraints in that growth. There's something standing in the way of that dream, that vision, that aim, whatever you want to call it. There's something significant, or it seems significant to them, that gets in the way of them achieving that. And so my work is to get clear, and this is one of the major processes we do in the very front of the conversation, is we get very, very clear about the constraints that are in the way, quote unquote, in the way. And I'm going to air quote those now because we're going to transform the way that we see those or think about those. Because when they are in the way, what that does for the creative mind, for the part of the mind that's triggered by a challenge that you believe you can overcome. If you don't believe you can overcome, it shuts down all creativity. There isn't any creativity around solution, options, what am I going to try, all of that sort of stuff. So when it seems bigger than yourself, or it seems impossible to overcome, we rarely find a solution, because the solution is hidden within the process of creativity. It's hidden within the process of possibility that we hadn't thought of yet. Now, the challenge is, and I'm not saying it can't be done with a coach, but it's incredibly difficult. And this is the value of a coach, is somebody to offer you a different perspective around what might look like Mount Everest in front of you, or even something even bigger or impassable. And so that's where we start, is what are the restraints that you see that are in the way? We're going to validate those. Are they even a restraint? Are they actually in the way? Is that something we need to deal with? Sometimes we make mountains out of molehills. They're not even a thing. And then if we discover it is actually a mountain to be climbed, we want to put in process, or put in a plan that actually becomes the way to what you want, not in the way of what you want.
So you used, I think, both constraints and restraints. Are they the same thing, or you use them different?
No, I use them differently. Constraints so this is a good question. I'm really glad you asked this, because some people see their constraints as restraints. Restraints, I would look at, that's the word we use when you're tied down. Like you're incapacitated. There's nothing you can do. At least that's the context that I use it in. And words matter, and we have to have a common understanding. So that's what I would call restraints. Constraints are opportunities. They're the guide. They actually become the guidelines. So if you think about it this way, anytime you play a sport, most sports have an out of bounds. They have an out of bounds line. That's a constraint. It's not in the way of playing the game. It's part of playing the game. So I love your question, because I think part of the challenge for entrepreneurs is transforming what they believe to be a restraint into a constraint.
By clarifying what is which. So I agree with you. Words have meaning. Any training session I have, the first thing we do is let's agree to the vocabulary. Whatever our vocabulary is, here's what the terms mean, because I agree with you. You've got to have agreed upon vocabulary to be able to talk about the subject.
Yes.
So how does constraint, and you use the analogy of boundaries for an athletic field. So how does a restraint become a constraint?
It's first in the belief, and I know that can sound trite. It can sound whatever you want to make up about it, but we have beliefs about the things in our lives. That's just true. It's like gravity. So the first step is to question the belief that we have about the restraint. So one of the questions that I use is, if that weren't true, would you want to know? Like, if that thing weren't in the way for you to get there, would you want to know? That's very first step, is for me to gauge their level of openness of questioning the belief they have about the thing. If they say no, like, I don't see much possibility beyond this thing, I don't see how this could, or I'm not even open to seeing how it could, our work is done. That is now a restraint. You're dead right. But if they say, yes, I'm open, then we can go down a line of questioning that would start to help us understand, how is this actually for our success rather than against our success? That requires rather some imagination, some creativity, some opportunity to just say, hey, let's let go of everything we know about it right now, and let's frame it in a different way so that we can start to play with it. I use the word play very intentionally. It's one thing that we often forget in the realm of business, is that, oh, this can actually be play. And sometimes it's a good chunk of time just to keep inviting those clients and people, entrepreneurs, into the idea of play. How could we play with this differently that we haven't played with it before?
Now, is it just the entrepreneur, the founder, that you take through it? Or if they have a team, do you take the entire team through this exercise?
So depends. I want to start with the founder. If the founder isn't on board with this kind of thinking exercise, their influence on the team is so powerful that, and I've seen this happen over and over again. I would never say it's always true, but my experience is that I can train a team on something, but if the leader's not on board, it falls apart very, very quickly.
I couldn't agree with you more. You got to start with the leader. One of the things I teach you when I talk about change management, one of my rules is, in order to change an organization, you have to start with the leader. So if you want to change an organization, you got to change the leader. Now, that's two implications. The incumbent changes by changing how they think, how they look at it, what are the assumptions. The incumbent changes, therefore we can change the organization. Or if the incumbent can't do that, we change out the incumbent and go find somebody who obviously can make the changes. Anyway, so
Yep.
with your model. So once you've worked with the founder, working with the CEO, who's you've convinced him or her, and they now have a change of perspective. They see the world differently, in a fresh set of eyes that say, whoa, here's the opportunity and challenges. Where do you go from there?
Then we work with the team. I mean, the influence of the leader, we could do the same exact process that we did with the leader. We could do that with the team. And quite honestly, most teams that are healthy and functional and collaborative, they really look to the leader as the example for what is possible. So if the leader comes to him and says, hey, we could look at this a different way. I know right now it seems dismal. I know right now it seems pretty dire. And there are a million examples. I love history. There's a million examples over history that show this. George Washington, over and over and over again, displayed this role as a leader where it looked dire. It looked like we're done. And he saw the constraint. He had to, just reading biographies and stuff like that, you can assume he saw some of these constraints as opportunities, as what's going to actually get us to success. And then he can go and influence a whole group of people who think the whole thing's done. And he can actually lead them to a different mindset, lead them to a different belief about what they're up against. It's pretty amazing.
Oh, it is. And I love the fact you call on history, particularly military history, and George Washington. When you talk about seeing something that others saw as constrained or restrained, you saw differently. The one historical figure that comes to mind is Douglas MacArthur in the Pacific, and his strategy as he went from Australia up through the Pacific Rim. He didn't see water as an obstacle. He saw it as the Navy saw it. So here's this general who didn't view the water any longer like a typical soldier is. That's an obstacle. And I got that's a river crossing or a beach or whatever. No, he saw it, okay, this is a channel. So we got to follow. And he did it entirely different as he developed his strategy for that portion of the Pacific warfare. So that's great stuff. Okay, so now you're working with the team. So you've got the leader thinking differently. They're working with the leader. Where do you go from there?
Now everything's possible. Now we can inspect everything. This is when I start to see people get really excited about their work again. Because when something looks like a restraint, when something doesn't look overcomable, that is despair. I've come in to a lot of despair in the past over my time doing this work. And the moment when people believe there's something else possible is the moment when the despair starts to dissipate and the creativity starts to come to life. They've done some great studies around our constraints and obstacles and what happens to the limbic system and what happens to the frontal cortex. So one thing that I'm always listening for on a team or in a leader is if there is possibility in what's available and if they're committed to the possibility. So in these studies, they call them if constraints. And if it's an if constraint, meaning if I do this, we could get to there and then we would have the reward. If they're an if constraint, they will actually, and we relate to them that way, they will actually produce what's needed to create a solution. I'm constantly listening, and leaders can do this too. If you're checking in on your team to see how they're going to come up against obstacles, listen to the way that they talk about them. Do they talk about them in the realm of defeat? Or do they tend like it's always going to be this way? Do they take the past and project it into the future? Or do they talk about them like, we don't yet know? We're not quite sure what's available to us. We won't know until we go out on the battlefield. Now we're in war analogies, but you know what I mean? Like until we get out there on the field and start playing with it a little bit. And so that's the moment of transformation. And that's one of the takeaways that people can take away from this conversation is how well are you listening to your people as they relate to the constraints that are there? And can you identify when they see them as possibilities or they see them as a default future?
Right. Hey, listen, I regret that time keeps moving forward and we have a time constraint. So let me just summarize, as I told you, what are the three practical things? But then you and I, after we go off the air, we got to figure out when we're going to come back and continue this part two. But at least for part one, what are three practical things you want people to do as a result of today?
First one, name the constraint. So many people don't even get clear about what the constraint is. And this is specific, name it specifically, not generalized idea. Generalization is an excuse for inaction. So if you get very, very specific, very specific about the constraint, and then you know your enemy. I say enemy, I don't mean it enemy, but you know what I mean. It's the dragon you're up against, right? Then here's something we didn't even get to. But you can, if you want to take the creativity off the scale, you can actually exaggerate that constraint. You can make it even bigger than it actually is and say, if this thing was 10 times the size that it is now, the creativity will go off the charts and you'll get more ideas on the table than you did when it's the actual size of the constraint that you see. And by the way, the constraint might actually be a little bit bigger than you think it is, or it might be a little bit smaller than you think it is. So just be open-minded to what's actually there. And then get creative. Nothing is off the table. Bad ideas, good ideas, just throw it all out there. And then start to condense that into a plan of action that you're going to practice and try in order to start to go after this thing. And then I'll add a bonus. Can I add a bonus?
Sure, absolutely.
I already talked about it. Learn to listen how your people talk about the constraints. I can't stress this enough because you can catch this kind of thinking or you can catch their tone of thinking early and you can address it. But if you go into solve mode, if you go into solution mode and people are still seeing it as immovable, as a restraint, you will get fraction of the ideas, creativity, and solves on the table.
Awesome. So it's name the constraints, accentuate the constraints, be creative to solve it, and listen to your people as they talk about it.
That's right.
So unfortunately, that wraps up today. I want to thank everybody for reviewing. Thank you, Chad. I really appreciate this, and I look forward to part two as soon as we can. Take care, and God bless.
Thank you.
now got 3 ideas of what to share from today's podcast. So again, what I'd like for you to be able to do is take those ideas, make them your own, reflect on them. What do they mean to you? And then thirdly, commit to an action plan. Commit to actions that you can take to apply what we've talked about today. If you want help, if you want some ideas, if you want some accountability, please contact me. Contact me by sending me a text, 913-306-1499. Put podcast follow-up in the text message, and I'll get back to you within 24 hours. Thank you so much for listening today, and I'll see you on our next broadcast.